but in fact, what was initially conceived to be another arrow in the quiver of our PhD students has evolved over the years into a very successful MA program. Somewhat out of character, I want to deploy my own biography a little bit, the key points in this talk, because I think it will help me set up my main point. I received my PhD in 1971. That was the slide of the crisis of the job situation. That was the first year of the job crisis in history. Then the word crisis was the right word. It was sudden and definitely unexpected. Moreover, senior faculty had not a clue what was happening at the AHA meetings where they assumed jobs would beckon us. There was then no published job register, and students scurried around hotels on the basis of rumors and little signs posted on bulletin boards announcing interviews. The being so sudden, it made sense to call it a crisis and wait out the problem. Things would return to normality, the elders said. After half a century, we must acknowledge a new normal. The employment situation in academic history is endemic and structural. We face disinvestment in higher education at all but the wealthiest private institutions, where resources, in fact, are growing dramatically, and a long secular decline in humanities enrollments that began in around 1970. And in the Great Recession, they have accelerated. The structural mismatch between the production of PhDs and academic positions in academia will continue and perhaps worsen. The AHA has no present mechanism to control that production and even less chance of increasing demand. But turning back to my experience in 1971, I can say that I was lucky. I got a tenure-track job. It was at the University of Wisconsin's then new Green Bay campus. The job was not, however, in a history department. In fact, UWGB did not have a history department or any disciplinary departments. The campus represented an unusual experiment in higher education. The Madison administrators who conceived of it were seeking to respond to the educational critiques that were being made in the early 1960s by students before war protests took over. All departments at UWGB were interdisciplinary. Student activism was encouraged, required internships for all. And encouraging a cosmopolitanism was a major objective. Every student had to have what was called an other culture experience, usually accomplished by getting out of Green Bay in January. South Africa and South America were favored locales. The whole curriculum was oriented around environmental issues. There was a department of ecosystems analysis, and there was a department that focused on urban analysis. That is where my tenure line was. There were history courses, but no history major. I considered myself to be an intellectual historian, but my dissertation actually was about 19th century ideas concerning industrialization, social welfare, city planning. That gave me enough foundation to offer courses oriented to urban development and reform, as well as questions of community in contemporary urban life. In fact, my undergraduate seminar on that topic of community produced the idea for my book on community and social change in America. There was one course, they said, I had to be willing to teach, and I presumably able to teach, if I wanted the job. They already had a slightly odd name for it. It was The City Through Time and Space. By this they meant a global history of cities from their invention 10,000 years ago to the present, one semester. That kept me up late, but it was, in a real sense, foundational of a great deal of what I have done since. In short, I flourished in this non-history department that included city planners along with a cluster of various social sciences. It was very different from the disciplinary closure and isolation typical of universities then. I was happy to be educating students who would be equipped to make urban lives better, whether as citizens or as urban professionals. In fact, I did not care that no student in the whole place undertook a major in history. But large numbers of students were learning history, learning historical thinking, learning to use documents, learning to make explanatory narratives that could be used in the world. I was delighted that young men and women who might shape the future in our cities could think like a historian. Unfortunately, that experiment didn't work. Like the experimental UC Santa Cruz, founded at the same time for similar reasons, UW Green Bay evolved rather quickly into a more or less standard issue mid-sized state university campus. I moved to New York and NYU, and New York became the focus of my research for the next 15 or 20 years. And from there, I went global more recently. No longer an alienated 27-year-old, I have been for many years delighted to be teaching undergraduate majors in history and doctoral students in history. But my main point is that both the Green Bay work I did when it seemed to be working and that I now do at NYU appeal to me. Can we have both? It would mean an enormous expansion of who we are as a profession. While I was writing New York Intellect back in the 1980s, I discovered that in some ways, UWGB reflected the founding ideals of the historical profession in the United States more than NYU did. Can we go back to the future? When Johns Hopkins and Columbia established the first graduate schools, they described them in civic terms, not in narrowly academic or disciplinary terms. They proposed to educate what they called civic leaders. In his annual report for 1880-81, the president of Columbia explained that the new graduate faculty was created to develop the mental culture. That's not a kind of word we have much use for these days. The mental culture of postgraduates, initially called the Graduate Faculty of Political Science, and the title's a clue. This new faculty took its work to be training men for civil service, the duties of public life, and public journalists. Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson responded to this vision of advanced learning. Roosevelt enrolled in the Columbia program in public law, the precursor of the Faculty of Political Science, while Wilson enrolled in Herbert Baxter Adams Seminar at Johns Hopkins explicitly to pursue careers in public life. A very large proportion of key journalists and reformers identified with the progressive movement were in these programs, as well as the one at Wisconsin. Anyone who has read Dan Rogers' wonderful book on the progressive era will see most of these people who show up in that story are out of Johns Hopkins, Wisconsin, or Columbia doctoral programs intending to do that kind of work, not academic work. I don't want to imply that all went into non-academic careers, but a significant number did, and some even moved back and forth, like John Finley, who moved between academia and editorship of the New York Times. In fact, 64% of PhD graduates of Johns Hopkins in the 1880s went into academic careers, but 36% pursued a variety of careers, many of them as reformers. Academic careers were not their first choice. Of those who took the PhD at Hopkins between 1900 and 1920, about 30% pursued social and civic leadership careers and non-college educational careers, whether in high schools or as educational administrators. And Rob Townsend had much more rich data that I didn't have when I started thinking about this. So I guess I want to say we have not necessarily made a wrong turn, but we did forget a lot. And we're even not so conscious of our own present experiences. When I discovered this history, I realized that I'd forgotten my own history. I made a count of job choices of 40 students whose dissertations I at that point advised at NYU. About a quarter went as a first choice into non-academic history careers in museums and archives, but also community advocacy, editing, both book editing and magazine editing, filmmaking, independent fiction and nonfiction writing, authoring for young adults, university administration, a PBS and ABC News producer. And I want to say something about the last one because the question of whether or not these is the second tier of graduates. The student who as an ABD became a producer for Bill Moyers and insisted to me that she absolutely did not want an academic career. What she wanted to do was to be able to do serious nonfiction reporting. Her first choice was the New Yorker, but it turned out okay anyway. Anyway, even while Moyers was doing everything he could to advance her journalistic career, he insisted to me and to her that she complete her dissertation, which incidentally won the Alan Nevins Prize in the Society of American Historians. So, on the basis of scattered accidental knowledge, I just want to add a few other sort of domains that history people get jobs, good jobs. McKinsey, Deloitte, these consultancies are very intellectually high-powered and very open to historians. They like historians because historians have very strong analytic skills of a different sort than their economists, and they're very good at macro domains. We deal naturally with explanation by way of interdependent variables, while most economists, political scientists, and policy analysts are trapped in the search for the singular independent variable. Even more important, we can take a large body of documents and bring them together into a synthetic and explanatory narrative. Do not underestimate the value of this skill. Finally, we historians emphasize content over method, and as a result, historians bring a great deal of positive knowledge to whatever issues they address. This is especially valuable in domains like international affairs, another area where advanced historical training is valuable. New York's mayor, as some of you may know, is at the moment investing many millions of dollars in an effort to make the Silicon Valley in what used to be called Welfare Island in New York City. Like many, he sees the future of the economy in trained intellect in that domain. He may be right that more than engineers will be needed. There are content and use questions. Here, humanities folk are welcomed in the original Silicon Valley and will be at its imitators. There may be more opportunities there than we realize. Some Silicon Valley startups are eager to employ humanists as they move to content issues, especially in the domain of educational technologies, which they see as a rich domain of growth possibilities. Here I get personal again. My daughter is writing a dissertation in classics at Columbia University, a field with even fewer advertised teaching jobs than history. Her husband moved to Stanford this fall, and at a recent dinner with a distant relative of her husband's, someone who's responsible for 6 Silicon Valley startups, she was struck by the techie's insistence that Silicon Valley needs humanists, and that he has always been drawn to them as potential employees. They know how to think big, and they know how to write, especially they know how to write, he said. On a subsequent weekend, as an experiment, she sent an email and a CV to 31 startups, or fairly new companies, in the Valley and San Francisco that seemed to have an interest in educational technologies. The following Tuesday, this is quick, she had 30 responses. She followed up on a half a dozen and found them indeed enthusiastic about highly educated humanists. Ideas that might come natural to us, a historian, seemed mind-blowingly brilliant. and vice versa. She found her conversations with the techies enormously stimulating in return. I don't know what she will do, what she'll make of all this as it sinks in, but certainly her view of the possibilities, the future possibilities, has been widened considerably. And I would not at all be surprised if classics lost a really fine critic of Hellenistic poetry to Silicon Valley. And I would be delighted. I want humanities to play a role in all aspects of contemporary society.